Here we go.
Got it. All right. And can everybody hear me okay? Everything's good to go. All right. So, welcome. I'm going to put this in presentation mode. I'm also going to turn my camera off once I get started because I find it very distracting to see myself as I'm presenting. But I did want to let you put a face to a name and say thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited about this topic. I'm quite sure I have way too much information and it's totally fine. So we'll get as far as we get. And if anyone has questions afterwards, you certainly can reach out to me. I also have a lot of this content in an article up on Medium, so I will link you there.
For those of you that have just popped in, I am Lashara Fullwood. I am part of the Library Codelab Digital Inclusion team at Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. I have my wonderful guest here, Miss Louise Clark. She is part of Queen City Bites, and she is a certified accessibility training person. So we're thrilled to have her here, and she has tons and tons of fantastic information coming your way. And as I've informed earlier, we will be recording you all, but you are welcome to edit and turn your cameras off as well. And of course, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, and we will edit as much as we can so you all have only the information you would like posted as well. So please, let's welcome Louise one more time, and let's have this fun thing keep going. Go, Louise.
Yes, and I wanted to give everyone a heads up, and I apologize. I'm not sorry, but I am recovering from COVID from last week, and so my voice is a little crackly. I'm be drinking water, and I know it might be annoying, but we're gonna do this anyways because I'm very excited about it. So I'm going to turn off my video and get going. Okay, so we are considering accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities and differences. And, you know, I love the title because when I initially advertised this talk, I said considering accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities. I did not have the and differences, and that was something that I learned a little bit more about making that distinction, and I will share what I learned about that. So very excited to get going here. Oh, I always forget that this is there. We go. Okay, just very quickly, the organization that I represent is called Queen City Bites, and I'm just going to read out our mission. Our mission is to support underserved or marginalized communities in finding access to technology careers through offering technical instruction, educational resources, and an environment where networking and mentorship are valued. And we have a variety of different events. Luckily, we have been able to restart our Bites and Brews networking event. We have one coming up, and I think I saw Alyssa, and if it's the Alyssa who works with me, hopefully she can share a date, maybe in the chat, of the upcoming Bites and Brews. We also have Coffee and Code, and we have a variety of workshops, many of which we do in tandem with the library. And as La introduced, we have been working for the past, couple years now, doing programming, technical programming and instruction with Library Codelab. And just a little bit about myself. I am a UX digital accessibility consultant. I'm also a certified professional web accessibility specialist. And my background is, so I consult with designers and I work with product teams to help make their products more accessible and inclusive. My background is that I'm a web and application developer, and I'm also a former Latin American history professor, where I taught world history and Latin American history for about 10 years. And I have 3 kids, and I should have put pictures of my 2 little schnauzers, but I have two doggies. And what I'm going to try and cover today, just a quick introduction to GAAD itself, Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Then we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility and disability, cognitive disability diagnoses, cognitive accessibility, and then a little bit about long COVID. Okay, so the purpose of GAAD, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and this is from their site, this is from their organization. It's to get everyone talking, thinking, and learning about digital access, inclusion, and people with different disabilities. And I have a website here, which is https:// accessibility.day. Or you can just Google GAAD, GAAD, and you'll get tons of information. And like I said, if you're on LinkedIn, if you tap into some of the accessibility hashtags and GAAD, GAAD 2020, or if you're on Twitter, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of companies, a lot of professionals, a lot of accessibility advocates have produced all sorts of materials and conversations related to accessibility, digital inclusion. So I just take advantage of today and really explore a bunch of different sites and see what's going on. For those of you who may not be part of, you may not be a technologist, you may not be a designer, developer, maybe you've joined because you're interested in learning more about cognitive disabilities. I just wanted to share that when you see this term A11Y, what that means is accessibility. And the 11 stands for those letters in between the A and the Y, right? And thank goodness, because every time I type accessibility, I type it wrong. I spell it wrong, I flip letters. So A11Y helps shorten the term accessibility. And accessibility, digital accessibility means that websites, digital applications, tools, technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And I love this quote, and it's very famous by Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web. But he says, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." And another one of my favorite quotes that I always like to lead off with when I'm doing presentations is one by Marcy Sutton. And she says, "We must use our skills as technologists to protect the equal rights of users." And it's really fundamental that we do not build digital products or services that create barriers to access for people. Think about how important, for example, it is to be able to sign up for a COVID vaccine. That's a form that's very important, and guess what? In many instances, those forms were not accessible to people with disabilities. And a lot of times, those are the people who need that vaccine the most if they're able to receive it. So this is really fundamentally about civil rights. There's many definitions of disability. This is from the Americans with Disabilities Act. A person with a disability is defined as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such an impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. And so I have, kind of official disability categories: visual, hearing, motor, cognitive, which is what we're talking about today, and speech. And I will share this slide deck, and I do have links here to additional information about each of these categories of disability. I also wanted to include, and this is from the Microsoft's Inclusive Design Kit, but what does it mean to design inclusively? Designing inclusively doesn't mean you're making one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways for everyone to participate in an experience with a sense of belonging. And I would argue a sense of equity. That is what we are trying to do. We are trying to give everybody, this equal access to using and benefiting from our products and services. And did you know people with disabilities are one of the largest groups of minorities that are on the web, that are using mobile apps? And it's only it is also one of the only minority groups that any of us can join at any time. We can all have temporary disabilities, perhaps like long COVID, which we'll discuss in just a little bit. Or maybe a situational disability, like if you are outside and it's very bright and sunny and then you can't see your phone. So take just a second and think about this question. Who do you visualize when you think of a person with a disability? I have a slide here that has, 4 different photos of what might have come to mind. So I have an African American young woman who is in a wheelchair. I have a white woman with a cane that is typically identified with users who are blind, or used by users who are blind. I have a young child with a hearing aid that is visible. And I also have an image of a young African American man who has Down syndrome. Now, those are all images of people with visible disabilities, right? And visible disabilities, essentially, if I was to, well, I don't know if I can go back. I can, yay. Visible disabilities have some sort of visible indicator that for the general public makes us aware of someone's disability. But what we are talking about today in many instances are invisible disabilities. And there's so many memes. This is one of them. I grabbed it from this Rick Hansen Foundation website, which you can visit. But, thinking about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, thinking about fibromyalgia, dyslexia, Crohn's disease, arthritis, and we'll be talking about others today. But these are disabilities that are not necessarily visible to the general public. And I think some of the problems about invisible disabilities is that assumptions are made about people based off these visible indicators or lack thereof, about their abilities and capabilities, or what they may or may not be struggling with. I have this quote here from the Invisible Disabilities Association. It says, "People often judge others by what they see and conclude a person can or cannot do something by the way they look. This attitude can be equally frustrating for those who may appear unable but are perfectly capable, as well as those who seem able but are not." And I know we've heard there's, a million articles out there of people who say park in a handicapped parking spot. And because they don't have a visible disability, people make judgments about them and their parking in the handicapped spot. Okay. So what we're talking about today with disability is cognitive disability. Now, I said earlier that people with disabilities form a large minority of the population. And so I have the statistic here, 15% of the world's population experience some form of disability. And so cognitive disabilities, which is what we're going to explore, is the largest category of disability. And it's typically understood via what we term the medical model. This lens of the medical model, essentially it centers the perspectives of physicians who are treating people, right? It assumes that a person who has a cognitive disability or that they have a disorder or a defect that needs to be treated because they're deviating in some way from what is broadly termed, or in I'm air quoting here, normal cognitive development, right? So I wanted to explore just really quickly a few of the different cognitive disabilities that are these invisible disabilities. And give you some descriptions really from this medical lens. And then we'll talk about a different way of understanding cognitive disabilities. Oh, that's right. Okay. So the first one is aphasia, and aphasia is a condition that affects a person's ability to communicate. It can affect speech, it can affect writing, it can affect their understanding of both spoken and written language. And the interesting thing about aphasia is that it can be temporary or permanent. Permanent due to perhaps aging, temporary due to something like a migraine or a seizure. And it's actually been in the news recently because Bruce Willis was recently diagnosed with aphasia and is leaving his acting career because of that. Autism. So the medical diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. And I'm going to read to you a definition. So, and this is from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. Autism refers to a broad range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behaviors, speech, and nonverbal communication. And autism affects currently 1 in 44 children in the United States today. Now, with that being said, this is one of those disabilities that I realized and was made aware of by some of my colleagues. Thank you, Sharon Morrow. That there's a conversation happening within the autism community that people don't view themselves with having disabilities, right? They have what might be termed, let me see here, let me make sure I'm getting the term correct. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but it makes sense. A neurodiversity paradigm, that they are existing within a neurodiversity paradigm where there's a spectrum of different cognitive experiences and expressions of cognitive skills. So we will come back to that discussion in just a second. Okay, so that is autism. Attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. This is, an old term, and I want to emphasize an outdated term, is ADD, or attention deficit disorder. But there are actually, medical doctors now have use the term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are a couple of types that I'm highlighting here. The predominantly inattentive type, and this is a type that aligns with maybe that older concept of ADD, where you have maybe a poor memory, or you have inattention, you're easily distracted. You may even have poor executive function, right? On the other hand, you could have predominantly hyperactive type ADHD, and that's where you have maybe you're talkative, you have nervous energy, you're fidgety, you might struggle to wait your turn. This is actually one of the diagnoses that got me very much interested in thinking about cognitive disability because my husband has this predominantly hyperactive type ADHD, and he is fine with me sharing that bit of information. And I have watched him struggle with using the web, and particularly forms or any kind of long process. It's death by a million clicks for him because he gets very frustrated. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then dyslexia. Dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. People diagnosed with dyslexia have a lot of difficulties with accurate word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding abilities. My colleague at work, Madison, and I thank you, Madison, for also pointing out that people with dyslexia also have struggles with directions and direction sequencing. So, for example, someone might experience left-right confusion by telling a driver to turn left when they meant to tell them to turn right. We had a scenario where we had a consultant who was going over wireframes, design wireframes, and was describing parts of the wireframe and was using, right when they meant left and left when they meant right. So this is also part of the kind of dyslexic experience. And then dyscalculia is a math learning disability. And I know maybe all of us are saying yes, but there really is a diagnosis, and it affects about 3 to 6% of the population. And this is a diagnosis where people really struggle to work with numbers and do basic arithmetic. Really, a struggle to perform calculations, and it results in a really high level of mathematical anxiety. There's lots of articles about this diagnosis for children because, of course, it's important that we catch this so that they don't, grow up with that mathematical anxiety. That there are techniques and ways to work with dyscalculia. Okay. So I wanted to read out this quote, and this is I highly recommend watching this TED Talk. Jacques Denhouting, she is an autism advocate. She herself has autism, and she is also a research psychologist who studies autism. And she says, there are no right and wrong brains. All forms of neurological development are equally valid and equally valuable. And regardless of what type of brain you've got, all people are entitled to full and equal human rights and to be treated with dignity and respect. So, this is a whole conversation. It's a whole nother conversation where we could really explore this medical diagnoses versus kind of the social construct or social model, where really it's not that there is something wrong with people who have autism. What's wrong is that people who are designing our environment, and in this case, our digital products, our websites, our mobile apps, that we are creating barriers by not making sure we're designing and developing inclusively. Okay, now when we're talking about cognitive, obviously I copy it and paste it in. This is not the correct heading, but the heading is actually official, is cognitive skills. And these are the aspects of the cognitive space that we want to pay attention to when we are designing and developing. And I wanted to go through these categories, which is, attention, attention being, the ability to stay focused on something specific, or being able to redirect focus from one thing to another. when needed. Then language and literacy, a huge category, which is about visual processing and decoding characters and illustrations, being able to write fluently. And I also want to say I'm taking a lot of these descriptions. I saw a fantastic, I'm losing the word, a fantastic presentation at AxCon recently by Rain Michaels, and she works at Google, and she did a whole presentation on making content usable for people with cognitive disabilities. So I highly recommend that, and I do link to her work in my article. So these are her kind of definitions. Learning. So learning typically is defined as an individual's ability to take in and maintain information. It's also looked at in the context of, learning skills. For example, people with reading disabilities, or people who have difficulties with numerical processing. They might be considered, both of those are considered, issues in the learning space. Memory. Memory is oftentimes thought of, long-term or short-term memory. Long-term memory has to do a lot with learning, which we just talked about. And then short-term memory has a lot to do with executive functioning. Rain also mentions that memory can deal with a person's reliance on visual or spatial memory, and then as well auditory memory. And then finally, executive function. So executive function is an individual's ability to plan, to organize, to have the emotional control that they need in order to navigate a specific situation the way that they do, or the way that they intend to do. Okay. Make sure I'm okay on time. Doing good? All right. So cognitive accessibility. We've talked about cognitive disabilities and differences. So let's move into cognitive accessibility. So this is where we are supporting the digital accessibility needs of people with cognitive disabilities. This is where we want to be mindful in the design and development phases of creating products and services. We want to be mindful of people with cognitive disabilities and make sure that we're not accidentally creating barriers for them to use our product. I have linked here in this slide deck, it's making content usable for people with cognitive disabilities for people with cognitive disabilities. I think I may not have put the whole title in, but let me open up this link really quickly. This is on the W3 website, making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. I really highly encourage you, if you're a designer or developer, to take some time and look through this document, because there is a lot of amazing information to help each of us understand how to design and develop by keeping in mind people with cognitive disabilities. And so, we have user stories, which are, of course, very helpful for getting context and understanding what we will be going through here in just a second, which are the various objectives of what designers and developers want to do when building products. Okay, and I'm not going to read through these bullet points, but these bullet points are from their website and basically go through the different aspects of the document itself, which is what I just did. Okay, let me get back into slideshow mode. Okay, so there's 8 objectives that I want to kind of go through, and I know that it will be very quick And there's a lot more to say than what I'll say in this short presentation. But hopefully, at the very least, I'll expose you to some of these objectives to keep in mind. So, first one is help users find and understand what things are and how to use them. You want to make sure you're designing things with, make sure they have a clear purpose. Make sure you're using common design patterns. And sometimes incorporating common symbols, not a creative and newly designed icon, but something that is very familiar amongst the general public. Those type of symbols can be used to clarify content. And I love this quote. This is by Adaptation. She is a designer, an accessibility designer. I may have her title wrong, over at Shopify. And she also has a fantastic presentation from AXCON, DeQ's AXCON conference that I do link to. So I highly recommend watching that as well. She says, using common patterns in existing mental models is a great way of reducing cognitive load. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. As much as possible, following existing patterns is really helpful for people with cognitive disabilities. And I want to say, I heard Glenda Sims from DeQ say this, or something along the lines of this, and that is that, so, this quote here, it makes it sound, like, well, yeah, common patterns, that makes sense, that's good usability. Well, for people with cognitive disabilities, this good usability is accessibility, because without this good usability, there are barriers to understanding and interacting with your product, if that makes sense. Two, help users find what they need. Help users find and search for critical information. Help users clearly navigate through your site, your application. Rain Michaels says, when somebody has an accessibility barrier, the difficulty of bad design, or even sort of seemingly good but not quite good enough design, can have a 10 times negative impact on the individual that really becomes a blocker and makes it impossible for them to use the system. So remember, findability, searchability, and clear navigation. Good tenets, tenets of good design, but really vital for good accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities. 3, use clear content. So we want to make sure content is understandable when read in context. And I think that when read in context is the important thing. What does it mean to be understandable? We want it to be clear and concise, simple, and there are a variety of tools that can be used to help assess, say, reading level of your content. But what can also help your content is the context with which it is laid out. So this is where you want to have a good visual layout. You want to help users make appropriate connections. And this is, through techniques using white space and background, foreground contrast. And if you're a developer, making sure, or a designer, and you're annotating your designs, make sure we're using good HTML heading semantics and really good HTML semantics all around, because all of that helps contribute to a nice visual layout. And then also images and videos should be clear and easy to understand. and there are, there are certainly techniques, we can't go over them today, but there are many techniques to make these images and videos clear and easy to understand. Captioning videos, for example, certainly helps make videos more avoiding images with text overlaid, on top. So there's many techniques, but they shouldn't be avoided because they can be really helpful to your design and to creating an understandable, content. But you do need to take the initiative to learn how to make these images and videos clear and easy to understand. Okay, 4, help users avoid mistakes and know how to correct them. So this is, gosh, and I meant to link, shoot, I'm going to have to put it in chat after the video. There was yet another AxCon presentation about error messaging. What was her name? Anyways, okay, I'm sorry. I'm distracting myself. I will get you the link to that very good presentation. But helping users avoid mistakes. What are we talking about? We want error prevention, right? So, for example, in forms, which is one of the number one areas where users can encounter errors. We want to design using labels for our inputs, right? We want helper text if necessary. Like if we need to have a certain format, helper text would be fantastic. If it's a long form or a complicated form, we'd love to have some instructions for the user. Anything that can help them, not get an error. That is really the ideal scenario. Again, if you're talking about forms, any form of autocomplete, autofill assistance, get your developers to, and I'm sure they are, but if they're not, develop in such a way that is, that we can pull through data that we already know and, and fill out these input fields, for people. One, it prevents, just basic errors like typing errors, but 2, it helps reduce cognitive load, and we'll talk more about cognitive load in just a second. I think I've mentioned it a couple times now, but just that energy that's needed to fill something out like a form. I know I always feel really happy when half the form is already filled out for me. Because it means I don't have to spend my time, my energy on filling that form out. And that, of course, is that feeling is amplified and 100-fold if you are a user with a cognitive disability. And then, of course, we want to provide inline error messaging. We want to provide appropriate guidance, very clear language to instruct a user on how to fix an error if an error has been made. I like this quote. Users often perform, and this is from the 10 usability heuristics for user interface design. So users often perform actions by mistake. They need a clearly marked emergency exit to leave the unwanted action without having to go through an extended process. When it's easy for people to back out of a process or undo an action, it fosters a sense of freedom and confidence. Exits allow users to remain in control of the system and avoid getting stuck and feeling frustrated. So this is another aspect of this objective. We want to empower all of our users that they can be in control and that when faced with errors, they know how to either correct them or get out of that particular part of the flow.
Louise?
Yeah.
Take one quick moment to reiterate the difference between helper text and instructions.
Helper text might be something like I wish I had an image for you. Right below an input, it might be a bit of text that shows you how to format, say, a date. So maybe they want it to be a two-digit month, a two-digit day, a four-digit year. So below the input, they might have MM dash DD dash YYYY to indicate to a user that input should be formatted in that way. Sometimes people use placeholder text to communicate that kind of as the helper text. But that's actually a problematic approach because placeholders in an input go away the minute they receive focus and the user starts typing. So it's nice to have that helper text below the input so that it persists regardless of what the person is doing in an input, in a field input. Instructions, I think of more like, especially with a long form, maybe it's instructions at the top of a section of a form, if that's necessary. Maybe there's instructions saying, before you get started with the form you see below, make sure you have, your loan documents in front of you, or your birth certificate, or, that's what I think of as instructions. Because the frustrating thing would be to get into a form and then, and it says, please give us your loan account number, and you're like, darn it, I don't know my loan account number, right? And see, that's memorization. You have that's assuming that you would have this a loan account number memorized, and you don't. So instructions like that so that you can have it available.
And then how does the inline error messaging work with all of that?
Yes, so inline error messaging, it's like if you have, again, I wish I had visuals for you, but if you have, say, let's say an email field, right? So at the top, you've got your email label, you've got your input field, and maybe you accidentally didn't put the @ in the email. Then, immediately right in line with that input, it would be an error message telling you how to correct your mistake that you made in formatting your email. So it's really close to the area where the mistake is. And that way you're not having to say, maybe scroll up and see the error message and then scroll down and find where the error message is, right? It's right next to the area that you need to make corrections.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I had a couple of those questions from our wonderful participants, and I just didn't want to go too further past that before you went back over that. So thank you.
And I will put, like I said, I will put the link into that really wonderful presentation that really was all about errors and forms. And the presenter had been working in fintech for probably 5 or 6 years, I think she said. So, she was all about forms and errors, and it was wonderful. Okay, now we're coming up on time. So I will move through a little bit quickly. Help users focus. We want to limit interruptions. And what does that mean? So maybe I hate this when I go to CNN's website and I'm reading an article and I scroll down, and then all of a sudden this video pops up to the side. It starts playing, it's loud, it's annoying, and it's a commercial, right? It's not even, anyways, that is so annoying, and I get mad and frustrated, and I'm trying to figure out how to close it to get back to what I was reading. And if I was a person with a cognitive disability, that might be so overwhelming that you just leave the site entirely. In fact, I wish CNN would do some user testing around that, because that is totally annoying. So you want to limit interruptions. What else can be an interruption? Any type of pop-up is an interruption. Carousel, dynamic carousel content, that's scrolling. Just say no to carousel. It's going to put that in there. Just never use them. Anyways, back to our regularly scheduled programming. You will also want to assist users in knowing the progress and status of a workflow. So, for example, using my husband, if he's in a form, and even if it's a progressive form, so it's showing one to three questions that he's got to fill out, or inputs, or that he's got to fill out, and then it goes to the next one. Well, that's a nice design. That's that kind of progressive reveal of this form, and it keeps the user focused on just the few questions. They're not overwhelmed with a lot of information that they have to put in. However, if he gets into that and it continues and he doesn't know when the end is coming or where he is in that flow, he starts getting really agitated and upset. And honestly, he will just leave a form. And sometimes he'll ask my assistants to help him get through a long form like that. And that should never be the case. We should never force people to be dependent on other people when it's something that through our design and development, we can design and develop a form that also maybe has a progress indicator. Lets them know the status of where they're at in a process. Whether it's a form or a process, let them know where they are, what they're doing, and when is the end coming. And I wanted to relate all of this to spoon theory. I was watching a wonderful presentation with Glenda Sims and Jenny DeLisi, I think is how you pronounce her name, and I apologize if I got it wrong. But they mentioned the use of spoon theory in relation to cognitive accessibility. And spoon theory, it's a metaphor created by Christine Miserandino, where she explains, and I'm going to read this quote, this is from her, that energy is a precious and limited resource and is more difficult to replenish than it is to use. Throughout a digital experience, there can be energy stealers, distractions, and triggers, and frustration. These may have an even larger impact on people with cognitive disabilities. The energy it takes to complete a process within a digital space can be its own type of digital barrier. So think about that, because for a lot of us, we have as many spoons as we need, but for a lot of people with cognitive disabilities, or let's say chronic health issues, such as fibromyalgia, you may have a limited number of spoons of energy, and when those spoons are used up, that's it for the day. And if, you may borrow against, your next day, but you still only have a limited number. So we want to think about how much energy we are asking from our users when they're using our product. 6, ensure processes do not rely on memory. We've mentioned some of these. Help users remember their last steps. Allow users to cut, copy, and paste content to avoid memorization. Simplify that navigation menu for voice menu systems so that there's not an overwhelming number of options. And then accessible authentication is also pretty important. I hate when you are asked to perform, a math calculation. Well, what if you have dyscalculia, right? So then you can't get through. Or who can recognize distorted characters? I mean, whether you have a cognitive disability or not, that's a very inaccessible means of authentication, trying to figure out what a distorted character is. 7, provide help and support, so make it easy for users to provide feedback, and then also to get human help and support. And then also related to this is provide different ways to understand content. So for example, if you have a graph, make sure maybe you have a description of what that graph is demonstrating, so that people can access information in different ways and get to the same, conclusions, or get the same information. And that's, a little bit related to this last objective, which is support adaptation and personalization. And, we want to avoid blocking the use of add-ons or extensions if we can. I understand there are security concerns. I've worked on projects like this where we couldn't allow for the use of add-ons or extensions like spell check. A spell check extension, or maybe you're using LastPass, right, to remember your password. And then support personalization and the simplification of content. And Glenda Sims says, in the area of cognitive accessibility, personalization is an absolute essential. And if we're going to say that we value differences, we need to actually support the needs of individuals. We need to let people select what works for them. So that's a whole huge topic, of course, for designers in particular, around the area of personalization. I'm not going to go through the WCAG and cognitive accessibility, other than to say WCAG does address some aspects of what we've gone through in terms of what we're trying to do with our digital products and making them more accessible. There's still, a lot to be done in terms of how we integrate the needs of people with cognitive disabilities into these compliance regulations. But I have listed here several of the guidelines that are related to cognitive. So if you're a developer or a consultant or a tester, you can look through these. And I wanted to end very quickly with a note about long COVID. And I have on the right an image of by the BBC about long COVID symptoms, including things like fatigue, shortness of breath, joint pain, chest pain, cough, loss of smell. There's many different symptoms, and brain fog, difficulty concentrating. All of these things really affect our cognitive skills. And so as we are designing and developing, I really feel like, and many design leaders out there are recognizing how important it is going to be to consider cognitive accessibility, given that given the growth of people who may not identify as having a disability or being, kind of neurodivergent, but that they have the same barriers and needs as people with cognitive disabilities, because they are experiencing cognitive disabilities with these COVID symptoms. And I will end with this quote by Ted Drake. There's a lack of information about how we can use our roles as accessibility and inclusive design leaders to improve the usability of our products and services for people who have long COVID and its associated disabilities. Now is the time for us to reevaluate our work to include short-term memory loss, anxiety, loss of focus, readability, and alternative documentation formats. And I know we're at time, so I just want to say that, I have an article on Medium that has a lot of resources on it for all of us who are, designing and developing, products and services. So by all means, please reach out to Queen City Bites. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Again, my name is Louise Clark. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Louise. That was wonderful. It's always a great time being able to have accessibility programs with Queen City Bites through you, Louise. And folks would like your personal LinkedIn information, if possible, and email. And are you sharing the slides with us this time? Are you sharing your slides? Okay, she will be sharing the slides, so you all will be receiving that. And then within the week, we should have the recording from our Charlotte Mecklenburg Library YouTube page, so you all can access this there as well. And again, we appreciate your time and your attendance on behalf of Louise Clark and me, Lashara Fullwood, from Digital Inclusion Library Codelab and Green City Bites. We appreciate you coming and thank you for your time this afternoon. Enjoy your day.